Warm welcome. Get comfortable. Dim the lamp, let the fire settle. You've found the Somnorian, where we take one narrow slice of the medieval world and turn it over slowly until the whole thing makes sense. Tonight it's houses, the timber, the mud, the smoke, the mortgage-free but structurally doomed reality of where ordinary people actually slept for roughly 1,000 years. If you enjoy this sort of thing, and only if you genuinely do, the like button helps more than you'd think, and subscribing means the next one finds you. And I'm always curious. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what the weather's doing. Let's start at the bottom, which in medieval building means the dirt. Here is the first thing to understand, and it reframes everything that follows. A medieval house did not have foundations in the sense you mean. There was no concrete pad, no footing dug below the frost line, no damp-proof course, no engineered anything. For most of the early and central Middle Ages, across most of northern Europe, the technique was this. You sharpened the ends of your main structural posts, you dug or drove holes into the ground, you dropped the posts in, and you packed the soil back around them. That's it. That's the foundation. Archaeologists call this construction earth-fast, and the holes it leaves behind, dark circular stains in the subsoil, packed with a distinct fill, sometimes with post pipes where the wood rotted in place, are the single most common feature on any excavation of a medieval or early medieval settlement in Britain, Denmark, the Low Countries or northern Germany. When you read that a site produced a longhouse, what was actually produced was a pattern of stains in the ground where the wood used to be. The building is gone. The holes are the building. And the reason the building is gone is beautifully, depressingly simple. Oak buried in soil rots at the ground line, not at the top where it's dry, and not deep down where it's consistently wet and starved of oxygen, but precisely at the interface. That band of a few inches where moisture, air and fungal spores all coexist in perfect harmony. It's the same reason a fence post today snaps at the base rather than in the middle. Modern experimental archaeology and long-term timber trials give untreated oak somewhere in the range of 15 to 30 years in the ground before the ground line section is compromised, less in wet clay, more in free-draining gravel, and considerably less for anything softer than oak. Which means the house you built as a young man was structurally suspect by the time your eldest child was thinking about marriage. There is a version of home ownership where the building is a slowly deflating asset with a known failure date, and everyone involved simply accepted it, and that version is most of the Middle Ages. The archaeological record makes this brutally visible at a site like Weststow in Suffolk, where the settlement shows successive buildings razed, abandoned and replaced nearby rather than repaired in place. The post holes overlap and cut each other in sequences that let you read the generations off the ground. The same pattern appears across the great excavated village of Warham Percy in the Yorkshire Wolds, where a full campaign of digging over 4 decades found peasant houses that had been rebuilt repeatedly on shifting footprints, sometimes drifting a few metres each time so that the house was less a fixed object than a slow-moving cloud of building events. People did not repair the rotten post. They rebuilt the house, sometimes on top of the old one, sometimes politely to the left of it. Now, and this is where the story turns, the fix for all of this was invented, and it was not complicated. You raise the timber off the ground. You put something between the wood and the soil that doesn't rot. In practice, that means a sill beam, a horizontal timber laid flat, into which the vertical posts are tenoned, and which itself rests on a low wall of stone, flint, brick, rubble, or whatever was lying around locally. The sill can rot too, eventually, but it's cheap to replace compared to the whole frame, and crucially it can be replaced without dismantling the building. This is the single most important change in vernacular building in the entire medieval period, and it is, functionally, a plinth, a shelf. Someone worked out that if you put the house on a shelf, the house stops dying. The timing is genuinely interesting. Sill beam construction on low stone footings appears in England from roughly the 12th and 13th centuries in higher status buildings, and spreads down the social scale unevenly through the 14th and 15th, which is why virtually every surviving medieval timber-framed house in England, the ones you can walk into today in Lavenham or Webley or York, sits on a masonry plinth. That's not a coincidence of taste. That's survivorship bias in its purest architectural form. The houses that survive are the houses that solve the rot problem. Everything built the old way returned to the soil and is now a stain. When people say medieval houses were built to last, what they're really observing is that the medieval houses which didn't last aren't available for comment. The stone under those sills is worth pausing on because it tells you where you are. Medieval building was ferociously local. Hauling stone overland was so expensive that a cart journey of 10 or 12 miles could cost more than the stone itself, which is why the plinth under a house in Flint country is flint, in the Cotswolds is Ulitic limestone, in the Weald is sandstone, and on the Norfolk coast is a horrible-looking but perfectly functional mixture of beach cobbles and whatever fell out of a cliff. In areas with no useful stone at all, much of the clay midlands, parts of the fens, builders used brick where they could get it, or reused Roman material, or in some cases simply laid the sill on a bed of rammed earth and gravel, and accepted a shorter life. Geology decided the bottom 18 inches of your house, and you had no vote in the matter. Which brings us to the ancient and universal builders' tradition of taking things that are already there. Medieval builders robbed Roman sites with an enthusiasm that borders on industrial. Roman villas, forts, town walls, roads and mausolea across Britain, Gaul and the Rhineland were quarried systematically for centuries. Cut stone, tile and brick lifted out and carted off to become church footings, house plinths and field walls. Roman brick and tile is a particularly obvious tell because it's thin and wide and red, and looks nothing like medieval brick, and once you know it, you start seeing it embedded in Saxon and Norman church walls all over England. St Albans Abbey is famously built substantially of material lifted from the Roman city of Verulamium immediately next door. Brixworth Church in Northamptonshire has Roman brick arches over its windows. The material was free, it was already dressed, it was sitting in an abandoned building and nobody objected. Recycling was not a virtue. It was just the cheapest option, and being the cheapest option, it won. The same logic operated on a smaller scale in any settlement with a history. When you build a new house on a village plot, the plot has usually had a house on it before, so the ground is full of previous foundations, previous rubble, previous everything. Excavators routinely find post holes cut through the fill of earlier post holes, sills laid on top of demolished older walls, and property boundaries that persist for centuries even as the buildings on either side of them come and go 3 or 4 times. The plot outlives the house. In many English towns, the burgage plots laid out in the 12th and 13th centuries, those long narrow strips running back from the street frontage, are still legible in the property lines today, 800 years and several complete rebuilds later. Your house is temporary. Your neighbour's fence line is forever. Site selection itself followed a very short and very sensible list of priorities, and drainage sat near the top of it. Water is the enemy of every part of a timber building. So the ideal spot was a slight rise, on free-draining subsoil, above the floodline, with a water source close enough to carry from but not close enough to come indoors. You see this decision made over and over in the landscape. Settlements strung along the spring line where permeable chalk meets impermeable clay, and water emerges naturally. Villages hugging the contour just above a floodplain. Farmsteads sited on gravel terraces beside rivers rather than on the silt beside them. Where the ideal wasn't available, people compensated. Raised platforms of dumped earth and rubble, drainage ditches cut around the building, floor levels built up incrementally over decades as occupation debris accumulated. On some excavated urban sites, the floor level of a building rises by a foot or more over its lifetime, because the fastest way to deal with a damp floor was to put a new floor on top of it, and on truly bad ground they built anyway. The wetlands of the Somerset Levels, the marshes of the Low Countries, and the Turpin Mounds of Friesland, artificial dwelling mounds raised by hand over generations to keep entire settlements above the tide, represent an enormous investment of labour in ground that would be condemned by any modern surveyor. In waterlogged conditions, builders drove piles, laid brushwood rafts, and set buildings on timber platforms, which has the incidental and delightful side effect that the wood didn't rot, because permanently waterlogged anaerobic conditions are the best timber preservative known. Some of the finest surviving medieval woodwork in Europe comes out of the ground in exactly the places medieval builders least wanted to build, which is the kind of joke the past enjoys playing. The other constraint on where you built was that in most of medieval Europe you didn't own the ground. Peasant tenants held land from a lord under a variety of arrangements, customary tenure, copyhold, villenage, and building on it involved obligations that show up constantly in manorial court rolls. Manorial courts fined tenants for letting their houses fall into decay with a regularity that suggests it was less a crime than a revenue stream. The recorded formula is usually some version of the tenant permitting his house to be ruinous, followed by an order to repair it within a fixed term under threat of penalty. The Lord's interest was straightforward. A decayed holding produced less rent and was harder to relet, so the state of your roof was legally the Lord's business. There is something quietly modern about being fined by a landlord for the condition of a building you built yourself out of trees you had to ask permission to cut down, because that was the other half of it, and it's where the next part of this story goes. The ground gave you your footing and your drainage and your stone, but it did not give you your timber, and the timber was the expensive part. A house was a standing claim on woodland, negotiated, measured and granted, and the negotiation happened long before anyone dug a hole. Chapter 2. Felling the forest. Two things happen when you decide to build a house in the 13th century. First, you go and look at the trees. Second, you go and find the person who owns the trees, because it is almost certainly not you, and the conversation you have with him will determine the shape of the building for the next 200 years. Woodland in medieval Europe was not wilderness. This is the single most persistent misunderstanding about the period, and it distorts everything downstream. The image of endless, untouched primeval forest stretching from the Channel to the Urals is a 19th century romantic invention, and the documentary record demolishes it comprehensively. Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records woodland across England with an accountant's precision, not as scenery but as an asset, measured in the number of swine it could support on autumn pannage, or in linear dimensions, or in acres, and the total it records is startling to anyone raised on the forest myth. Something in the region of 15% of England was wooded at the conquest. That is less woodland, proportionally, than modern England has today, after a century of deliberate replanting. The trees had been managed, felled, coppiced, and accounted for continuously since prehistory, and by the 11th century England was a country with a wood shortage in some regions, and a wood industry in all of them. What that woodland actually was, physically, is the thing worth getting right, because it explains what medieval buildings look like. The dominant management system was coppice with standards, and it's an elegant piece of biological engineering that almost nobody today has seen working. Coppicing exploits the fact that most broadleaf trees, hazel, ash, willow, alder, sweet chestnut, lime, oak to a degree, do not die when you cut them down. They resprout from the stump, which is called the stool, throwing up a cluster of straight vertical poles. Cut them again on a cycle of 7 to 15 years, depending on species and intended product, and you get a permanent, renewable, self-replacing crop of poles at precisely the diameter you want. A coppice stool can live for centuries this way. Some hazel and lime stools in ancient English woods are estimated to be over 1,000 years old, which makes them older than every building in the parish and most of the families. The wood is not consumed by cutting. It is harvested in rotation, like wheat, on a compartment system where a different section is cut each year, so that at any moment a managed wood contains a full age range from freshly cut stubs to poles ready for felling. The standards are the exceptions. Individual oaks left uncut among the coppice, allowed to grow on for decades to produce the large structural timber that coppice poles cannot. 50 to 100 years for a serviceable frame timber, longer for something substantial. And this is where the numbers start to get uncomfortable, because a standard oak takes a human lifetime to grow, and roughly 40 minutes to fell, and the accounting mismatch between those two figures shaped the entire economy of building. So how much wood does a house eat? Actual figures from the archaeology and the buildings themselves are sobering. Reconstruction projects and timber count surveys of surviving frames suggest that a modest peasant house of 3 bays consumed something in the range of 30 to 60 trees, mostly small oaks, not the grand stuff, while a substantial yeoman's or merchant's house of the 15th century ran to 200 or more. The Guédelon Castle project in Burgundy, which has been building a 13th century castle from scratch using period technique since 1997, has produced running figures on this that consistently surprise people. The roof structures alone consume oak in quantities that require standing forest, measured in hectares, not trees. Scale up to a cathedral, and the numbers become almost comic. The roof of Notre Dame de Paris, before the 2019 fire, was known as La Forêt, the forest, because its 13th century oak framing was estimated to have used somewhere around 1,300 trees, each felled from woodland that had been growing since roughly the 9th century. When it burned, the immediate question in French forestry circles was not whether the timber could be replaced, but whether France still had enough oak of the right dimensions standing anywhere. And the answer required a national survey and donations of individual trees from private estates. Which brings us to the negotiation, because you cannot simply walk into a wood and take an oak. Rights over woodland in medieval England were layered, specific, and enforced with enthusiasm. The lord held the soil and the standing timber. Tenants might hold rights of estover, a customary entitlement to take wood for specified purposes, and the categories are wonderfully precise. Houseboat was wood for building and repairing your house. Haybot or hedgeboat was wood for fences and hedges. Fireboat was wood for fuel. Ploughboat was wood for repairing agricultural implements. These were not general permissions, but defined allowances, often specifying species, size and quantity, and frequently limited to what could be taken by hook or by crook, that is, dead wood and branches reachable with a bill hook or a shepherd's crook, without felling anything living. The phrase survives in English as an idiom about achieving something by any means available, and its origin is a medieval restriction on how much wood a peasant could take out of a wood. The manorial court rolls are full of the enforcement. Fines for taking green wood where only dead was permitted, for cutting oaks without license, for overloading the pannage, for felling in a compartment that wasn't due. Royal forest law was harsher still, and it's worth being clear about what forest meant because it did not mean trees. A royal forest was a legal jurisdiction, an area, wooded or not, subject to special law reserving game and vert to the king, and at its greatest extent under Henry II, something approaching a quarter, or even a third of England lay under forest law. Whole villages, farmland, heath. The offences were divided into those against the venison, meaning the deer, and those against the vert, meaning the vegetation that sheltered them, and the vert offences are the ones that bit ordinary builders. Cutting a tree in a royal forest without warrant was a prosecutable offence tried in the forest air, and the air rolls record steady streams of men fined for taking oaks, for asarting, clearing woodland for cultivation, and for the enduringly medieval crime of owning a dog that hadn't been lawed, meaning maimed in the foot so it couldn't chase deer. The Charter of the Forest of 1217, issued alongside reissues of Magna Carta, exists specifically because forest law had become intolerable, and it restored common access rights, including agistment and pannage and estover to free men. It is the less famous charter, and it is arguably the one that affected more people's daily lives, since considerably more of England needed firewood than needed protection from arbitrary imprisonment. Timber for major buildings therefore came as a grant, and the paperwork survives in quantity. The royal close rolls and liberate rolls are studded with orders from the king to a forest official to deliver a specified number of oaks to a named recipient for a named purpose. So many oaks from the Forest of Dean for the works at Gloucester, so many from Sherwood for a friary, so many to a favoured abbot for his church roof. The unit is the tree. Not board feet, not cubic metres, oaks, counted individually as gifts of considerable value. Henry III in particular gave away oaks with the liberality of a man who did not personally have to grow them, and religious houses across England were roofed on royal timber grants, recorded in a single line of Chancery Latin. There is a genre of medieval document that is functionally a receipt for trees. Then there is the matter of getting the wood from the wood. Transport was the punishing cost, and it structured everything. Moving heavy timber overland by ox cart on medieval roads was slow, expensive, and limited by the load a team could drag through mud, which is why water transport dominated wherever it was available, and why building accounts show timber travelling absurd distances by river and sea while stone from a quarry 15 miles inland was ruled out as unaffordable. Oak was floated, rafted, and shipped. The Baltic trade in Eastern European oak boards, called wainscot, brought high-quality, slow-grown timber into England and the Low Countries, in large quantities from the 13th century onward, and dendrochronology has since traced panel paintings and church fittings across Western Europe, back to specific Baltic and Polish forest regions by matching their ring patterns. A medieval English chest might be made of Lithuanian oak that arrived through Danzig. Meanwhile the man 3 villages over could not afford to have a cartload of stone brought to his door. For ordinary rural building, though, the wood was overwhelmingly local, and local meant something quite specific, not just nearby but from the hedge. Hedgerow trees, field-edge oaks and small woodland pockets supplied enormous amounts of vernacular building timber, which is why surviving frames are so often built from disappointingly small, knotty, twisted, fast-grown trees, Hedgerow oaks grow in the open with plenty of light, so they branch low and spread wide, producing short bent trunks with wild grain instead of the long, clean boles a forest oak produces. A carpenter working with that material has to build around its defects, and the buildings show it. Beams follow curves, braces are cut from naturally bent limbs because a natural curve is stronger than a sawn one. The characteristic wobble of an old English timber-framed house is not settlement or charm, it is the tree. And the timber was young. This is the detail that most reliably surprises people, who assume medieval builders used vast ancient oaks. Dendrochronological analysis of thousands of surviving buildings across England and northern Europe shows that the standard structural timber of a vernacular medieval house was an oak of roughly 40 to 80 years old, often under a foot square in section, sometimes noticeably less. Builders used trees at the smallest size that would do the job, because larger trees were more valuable, harder to move, harder to convert, and belonged to someone with better lawyers. The economy ran on adolescent oaks. The felling itself was seasonal and deliberate. Winter felling was preferred across most of Europe when the sap was down, the ground was firm enough for hauling, agricultural labour was free, and the bark was tight, which mattered enormously because bark was not waste. Oak bark was the primary source of tannin for the leather industry, and in some regions the bark from a felled oak was worth a substantial fraction of the value of the timber, sometimes approaching or exceeding it for smaller trees. So the felling season was coordinated with the tanning trade, and bark peeling was a distinct and organised job with its own gangs and its own season, generally in spring when the sap rose and the bark lifted cleanly, which produces the mildly absurd situation that the ideal time to fell for timber and the ideal time to peel for bark were in tension, and the resolution varied by region and by who was paying. The tools were axes. Felling axes with long handles and relatively narrow blades worked from both sides of the trunk to produce a wedge-shaped cut, with the characteristic result that a medieval felled stump shows axe-cut facets, rather than a saw's flat plane. Two-man cross-cut saws for felling existed, but spread slowly and were never universal in the medieval period. The axe was faster in skilled hands for trees of the modest sizes actually being cut, and it left the timber ends less damaged. Waterlogged archaeological sites preserve the evidence directly. Worked timber from sites like the Somerset Levels trackways and various urban waterfront excavations shows tool marks so crisp that individual axe blades can be identified across different pieces, meaning you can sometimes tell that the same specific axe with the same specific nick in its edge cut two different timbers. Somewhere in a museum drawer there is a piece of wood that identifies a particular man's tool 800 years after he last sharpened it. Once down, the tree was converted on the spot wherever possible, because moving a whole trunk is moving a great deal of waste. Conversion meant splitting or hewing the round log into usable squared sections, and splitting came first in most vernacular contexts. Oak cleaves beautifully along the radius when it's fresh, and a riven surface follows the grain rather than cutting across it, which produces stronger, more durable, more weather-resistant material than any saw can. Wedges of iron and wood, a heavy mallet called a beetle, and a straight-grained log will produce boards and posts with an efficiency that looks like magic if you've only ever seen a bandsaw. Waste was minimal in a different sense too. The offcuts became pegs, wedges, laths and firewood, and the brushwood became hurdles and faggots for bread ovens, all of which meant that the house you were about to build had a documented lineage before a single joint was cut. Someone owned the trees, someone granted them, someone counted them, felled them in the right month, peeled the bark for a tanner in another town, split the trunks where they fell, and hauled the pieces to your plot behind a pair of oxen through winter mud. And every stage of that was governed by custom, by law, and by an accounting system that treated a growing tree as a slow financial instrument maturing over 80 years. The carpenter had not yet touched any of it. Chapter 3. The Carpenter's Green Oak. The carpenter arrives, and the first thing he does is refuse to let the wood dry. This is the detail that undoes most people's mental model of medieval building, so let's put it plainly. Virtually every timber-framed house in medieval Europe was built from green oak, wood felled within weeks or months, still heavy with sap, still soft enough to cut, still, in a meaningful sense, alive. Not seasoned, not stacked in a shed for 3 years. Green, wet, and worked immediately. Modern woodworkers find this close to heretical, because everything in contemporary practice insists that timber must be dried before use, or it will move, split, and ruin the joinery. And the medieval carpenter knew perfectly well that green oak moves. He simply had reasons, and the reasons were better than ours. The first reason is hardness. Seasoned oak is a genuinely formidable material, dense, tough, and abrasive, hard enough to blunt a chisel and turn an axe stroke. Green oak is dramatically easier. The moisture content of a freshly felled oak sits somewhere around 80 to 100% by dry weight, meaning the timber contains nearly its own weight again in water, and in that state it cuts like something between cheese and cheddar cheese adjacent hardwood. An adze bites cleanly. A mortised chisel drives through with hand pressure and a mallet tap rather than a full swing. A mortise that takes 20 minutes to cut in green oak takes well over an hour in the same timber 10 years later, and takes several ruined edges with it. When your entire toolkit is hand-forged iron that needs a smith and a fire to resharpen, the difference between 20 minutes and an hour compounds across the several hundred joints in a house, until it becomes the difference between a building that gets finished and one that doesn't. The second reason is that seasoning large structural timber is barely possible anyway. The rule of thumb for air-drying oak is roughly a year per inch of thickness, and a main post is not 1 inch thick. It's 8 or 9, sometimes more. That's the better part of a decade for a single post, during which it must be stacked, stickered, sheltered, protected from theft, and not needed. Nobody was going to fell an oak in 1390 so that it could be framed in 1399. The wood went from stump to frame in a matter of weeks, and the drying happened afterwards, in place, as part of the building. Which turns out to be the third and cleverest reason, because green oak drying inside a completed frame does something useful. As the timber loses moisture, it shrinks, significantly across the grain, almost not at all along it, and a joint designed with that in mind tightens as it dries. The oak grips the peg, the shoulder pulls up against the post. The whole frame, which was assembled snug, becomes locked. Combined with the fact that oak develops enormous internal friction as it hardens, the result is a structure that gets stronger for the first several years of its life and then stays that way for centuries. Medieval carpenters were not fighting the drying process. They were using it as the final stage of assembly. You built a wet house, and it clamped itself together. The costs are real and visible on every surviving building. Shrinkage across the grain of 5 to 8% is normal, so beams end up narrower than the day they were cut, gaps open where they meet, and infill panels of wattle and daub crack at their edges as the frame closes around them, which is exactly why redaubing was an ongoing chore rather than a one-off. Oak also checks as it dries, splitting radially along the grain, and those long dark fissures running down the posts of every ancient English house are not damage or neglect. They are the wood doing what wood does, and structurally they matter far less than they look, because a check running with the grain barely affects a post's ability to carry load. Half-timbered buildings across England, Normandy and the Rhineland are full of beams that appear split nearly through and have been holding up roofs since the reign of Henry VI. Then there's the twist. Oak has a mild spiral grain, and as it dries that spiral expresses itself as torsion. The timber slowly winds. Multiply across a whole frame over 400 years, and you get the leaning, bulging, out of true geometry that tourists photograph and estate agents describe as characterful. The crooked house of Windsor, the wildly listing frontages of Lavenham in Suffolk, the buildings on the shambles in York that lean toward each other overhead. A substantial part of that is not subsidence, not shoddy work, and not romantic decay. It is several hundred structural members, each quietly rotating a couple of degrees over centuries, all in the same direction, because that's the direction the grain went. The buildings are still turning, slowly, now. So the wood arrives green, and the carpenter has to convert it. In the medieval vernacular, this overwhelmingly means hewing rather than sawing, and the distinction matters because it leaves visible evidence you can read on any exposed medieval beam. Hewing means shaping a round log into a squared timber with axes. The log is set up on blocks. A line is snapped or scribed down its length, often using a chalked cord, one of those tools so simple it seems not to have a history, and in fact turns up in Egyptian and Roman contexts, and then the carpenter works along it. First comes scoring, a felling-style axe used to chop notches down to the line at intervals along the log, cutting across the grain to sever the fibres. Then juggling or knocking off the waste between the scores, which pops away in chunks. Then the finish pass with a broad axe, a heavy wide-bladed axe ground with a bevel on one side only, and fitted with a handle offset to clear the knuckles, swung in long paring strokes down the face to leave a flat, faceted surface. That surface is the signature. Hewn timber shows shallow scalloped facets running across the face, sometimes with the score mark still faintly legible where the finishing pass didn't quite reach. And once you know the look, you can walk into a medieval barn and immediately distinguish original hewn members from later sawn replacements, because sawn timber shows parallel straight kerf lines instead. Great Coxwell Barn in Oxfordshire, Harmondsworth, the surviving Cruck barns of the West Midlands. The ceilings of these buildings are a catalogue of axework by named but forgotten men who each swung with a slightly different rhythm. Sawing existed and mattered, but not where you'd expect. Pit sawing, a log laid over a trench or trestle, one man above and one below, driving a long two-handled saw, was standard for producing boards, planks, and thinner stock, and it appears in medieval illustrations frequently enough that it was clearly familiar work, but it's brutally slow for large sections and produces sawdust where hewing produces useful chips, and the man in the pit spends his working life beneath a shower of oak dust, which was recognised as the worst job on any site. Water-powered sawmills existed in medieval Europe. Villa de Honnecourt's famous 13th century portfolio includes a sketch of a water-driven sawmill mechanism, and documentary references appear from the 13th and 14th centuries in France, Germany and Scandinavia, but they spread slowly, faced guild resistance in some regions, and did not displace hewing for structural work in the English vernacular until much later. Cleaving deserves its own mention because it produced better material than any saw. Fresh oak splits along the radius with wedges and a beetle, following the medullary rays outward from the centre like slices of a cake, and because the split follows the grain rather than crossing it, riven material is stronger, more flexible, and far more durable in weather than sawn equivalents. Everything that needed to be thin and tough was cloven: laths, shingles, barrel staves, hurdle rods, and the pegs that held the whole building together. A riven oak shingle sheds water for decades because no cut fibres are exposed to soak. Now, the actual genius part, which is that the house was built lying down. Medieval framing is a flat assembly system. Each wall, each cross frame, each truss was laid out horizontally on the ground, on a level area of the site, on a temporary framing floor of planks, or sometimes on the sill beams themselves already bedded on the plinth, and cut, fitted and test-assembled flat before anything went vertical. This is not a minor procedural detail. It is the organising principle of the entire craft, and it solves the fundamental problem of building with hand tools and no measuring instruments worth the name. How do you make dozens of joints fit precisely in 3 dimensions when your timber is bent, tapered, twisted and irregular? The answer is scribing, and it is beautiful. Rather than cutting every timber to a standard dimension, which is impossible when your material is a wobbly hedgerow oak, you lay the actual pieces together in their actual final relationship, then use a scribing compass or dividers to transfer the shape of one directly onto the other. You are not measuring, you are copying. The irregularities of the individual tree are accommodated rather than corrected, so a curved brace fits its curved post exactly, once, in one position and nowhere else. The joint is bespoke, which is exactly why every joint had to be marked, but that's the next stage of the work. What matters here is the consequence. Because each timber was scribed to its specific partners, and because the whole frame was fitted flat before erection, the carpenter could check the entire building for square, for fit, for accumulated error, while every piece was still at knee height, and could be adjusted with a chisel by one man. Then it was taken apart, stacked, and carried to where it was going. In many cases the framing yard was not the building site at all. Carpenters worked in their own yards, or at the woodland edge where the timber was, and the finished, fitted, numbered components travelled to the plot as a kit. Which is, and I want to be careful here because the comparison gets thrown around lazily, functionally prefabrication, not metaphorically, literally standardised components, cut and fitted off-site, transported and assembled on location by a crew following a marking system. There is documentary evidence for medieval buildings being framed in one place and erected in another, contracts specifying delivery of prepared timber to a site, and, most strikingly, buildings that were dismantled entirely and re-erected elsewhere, which only works if the thing was designed as a demountable kit in the first place. The whole flat pack idea that we associate with a Swedish warehouse and an Allen key is a medieval carpentry technique with a 600-year head start, and the medieval version came with a full-scale assembly crew and beer. The tools that did all this were few and superb. The felling axe and the broad axe for conversion. The adze swung between the feet like a hoe, for dressing surfaces flat, and for finishing faces the broad axe couldn't reach. A terrifying tool to watch in use, and precise to a millimetre in trained hands, since a skilled adzman could dress a beam face smoother than a plane. The twibill or mortising axe, a long double-ended tool used for levering waste out of mortises. Augers with spoon or shell bits, turned by hand with a T-handle for boring peg holes. No braces with universal chucks yet, though the brace and bit appears in Northern Europe during the 15th century. Chisels and gouges. The framing square and the plumb bob and the chalk line, which between them handle every geometry problem in the building, and the scribe and compass, that pair of iron dividers, which is arguably the single most important item in the bag. Measurement itself worked differently than you'd assume. Medieval carpenters used units that were physical rather than abstract. Rods, feet, inches, but calibrated locally and often to the specific site. And, more importantly, they used proportional geometry rather than arithmetic. Setting out a frame meant striking arcs with a compass and a chord, using the square and deriving dimensions from ratios like the diagonal of a square rather than calculating them. A carpenter who could not do fractions could construct a perfect right angle, bisect any angle, divide a line into equal parts, and lay out a complex roof, all with a chord, a peg, and a straight edge. The mathematics is in the hands rather than the head, and through all of it, the wood is drying. From the moment the axe went in, the frame was on a clock. Cut, fit, raise, peg, and get it standing before the shrinkage started to open the joints you'd carefully scribed. Winter felling, spring framing, and a raising in good weather was the rhythm, which meant the carpenter's year had a shape to it as fixed as the farmer's, and the two competed for exactly the same labour at exactly the same moments. Chapter 4. Carpenter's Marks and the Great Raising. Look up at the joints in any medieval barn and you'll find, cut into the oak beside a mortise, a small chiselled mark, a Roman numeral, or something like one, 2 strokes, and a diagonal, 4 strokes with a curl on the last, a V with a line through it. They are everywhere once you notice, and they are the closest thing the Middle Ages produced to an instruction manual, a system of assembly notation that worked perfectly for people who could not read. These are carpenter's marks, sometimes called assembly marks or match marks, and they solve the problem created by the last chapter's technique. If every joint is scribed bespoke to its exact partner, then every joint fits in exactly one place, in one orientation, and nowhere else. Take 150 timbers apart, stack them in a cart, drive them 3 miles, and dump them on a plot of mud, and you have a catastrophic sorting problem. Unless, before you dismantled anything, you marked both halves of every joint with a matching number. Then the pile of timber becomes a puzzle with the answers written on it. The numerals are Roman, but not the Roman you learned. Because they are cut with a chisel or a race knife into wood, they are made of straight lines only. Curves are difficult in grain, and a curved cut wanders. So 1 is a single vertical stroke, 2 is 2, 3 is 3, and then things get interesting. 4 is usually 4 rather than 4, because subtractive notation requires you to read direction, and a chisel mark doesn't guarantee direction. 5 is a V, or a half V, or a single stroke crossed at the top. 10 is X, 15 is Verlev. Some frames run into the 40s and 50s on large buildings, and the marks stay legible throughout because the system is fundamentally additive and visual. You count strokes. A man who has never seen a written word in his life can count strokes, and it gets subtler because a simple number only tells you which joint, not which side. Medieval carpenters solved this with modifiers. A tag or flag added to the numeral, a small hook or diagonal tail, commonly distinguishes one side of the building from the other, so that mark 4 with a tag is the 4th truss on the north, and 4 without is the 4th on the south. Sometimes the distinction is made by cutting the marks on different faces, or by adding a cross stroke, or by reversing the direction of the tail. On many surviving frames, the marks read as a coherent grammar: number for position, modifier for side, position on the timber for orientation. It's a notation system with syntax, developed independently in workshops across Europe, and no medieval carpenter ever wrote it down because there was nobody to write it down for. The marks also let modern building historians do something rather wonderful. Because the numbering runs in sequence through a frame, gaps and duplications in the sequence reveal alterations. A bay added, a truss replaced, a section moved. When the marks on one part of a building run 1 to 7, and another part starts again at 1 with a different chisel profile, you're looking at 2 building campaigns possibly centuries apart. And when a building's marks run in an order that makes no sense on its current site, you may be looking at a frame that was erected somewhere else first and moved. The timber carries its own archaeology. Now to the joints those marks were labelling, and here medieval carpentry gets genuinely sophisticated in a way that deserves more credit than it gets. The fundamental unit is the mortise and tenon, a rectangular slot of the mortise cut into one timber, a matching projecting tongue, the tenon cut on the end of another, the tongue inserted into the slot. It is thousands of years old, appearing in Egyptian furniture and Neolithic well linings, and it remains the basis of all timber framing because it does the one thing you need. It locates 2 pieces of wood positively in relation to each other and resists them sliding apart in 2 of 3 dimensions. What it does not resist, on its own, is withdrawal. The tenon can simply pull straight back out of the mortise, which is what the pegs are for. And the pegs are the thing that most surprises people who assume old buildings were nailed together. Tree nails, trunnels, pegs, whatever your region calls them, are riven oak dowels, split rather than sawn so the grain runs true, shaved roughly octagonal or round with a knife or draw knife, and driven into a hole bored through the assembled joint. Iron was expensive, and in a timber frame it was also worse than useless. Iron rusts in oak. The tannic acid in oak reacts with iron in the presence of moisture, corroding the metal and simultaneously staining and degrading the surrounding wood in a black crumbling ring. A nailed oak frame would eat its own fasteners. So the frames are pegged, and the pegs are oak, and oak against oak with a bit of moisture simply grips harder. Then comes draw boring, which is the detail I'd put forward if I had to name the single cleverest routine trick in medieval carpentry. When you bore the peg hole, you don't bore straight through the assembled joint. You bore the hole in the mortise timber first. Then you assemble the joint dry, mark through the hole onto the tenon, take it apart, and bore the tenon's hole deliberately offset, a few millimetres closer to the shoulder. Reassemble, and the 2 holes no longer line up. Now drive a tapered peg through, and as it passes from one hole into the other, the peg's own stiffness forces the tenon to move, dragging the joint shut and clamping the shoulder hard against the face of the post. The joint is under permanent tension, pulled tight by the peg itself, with no glue, no bolts, and no clamps. The effect is enormous. A drawboard joint stays tight as the timber shrinks, because the peg keeps pulling. It can be assembled with hand pressure and a mallet, on the ground, by 2 men, with no lifting gear applying clamping force. And it means a raised frame doesn't need the joints to be perfectly cut to be perfectly tight. The peg takes up the slack. You can find pegs in 500-year-old buildings still visibly bent inside the joint, permanently deformed, still pulling. They have been holding the building shut since before Columbus sailed. Beyond the basic mortise and tenon, the vocabulary expands considerably, and each variant solves a specific structural problem. The lap joint, where 2 timbers are halved into each other, appears constantly in early work. The notched lap with a dovetailed profile resists withdrawal and is a reliable dating indicator since its form changes systematically through the 12th to 14th centuries, and building historians use those changes to date frames. Scarf joints used to join 2 timbers end to end, because a wall plate needs to run further than any single tree, come in a spectacular variety of forms. The splayed scarf, the stop-splayed scarf with under-squinted abutments and sallies, the bridled scarf, the edge-halved scarf with bridled abutments, each with its own regional and chronological distribution. There are people who can walk into a barn, glance at one scarf and give you a date range of 50 years. Some of them are extremely fun at parties and some of them are not. The tie beam locks the 2 side walls together against the outward thrust of the roof, and the joint where it meets the wall post and the wall plate is the most heavily loaded, most complex and most argued about assembly in the frame. In the classic English solution, the post is jowled, the top swelled out, usually by using the tree upside down so the natural flare of the root buttress provides the extra material to give room for a tenon on the tie beam and a dovetail housing for the wall plate simultaneously. That upside down post is a lovely piece of thinking. Rather than waste a huge tree to get one thick end, use a small tree the wrong way up and let the root flare do the work. Braces handle racking, the tendency of a rectangular frame to fold sideways into a parallelogram. A brace runs diagonally between post and beam, converting the rectangle into two triangles, and triangles do not deform. Medieval braces are usually curved, cut from naturally bent timber, and they come in two philosophies that map roughly onto region and period. Tension braces running down from post to sill, and arch braces running up from post to tie. The characteristic close-studded facades of East Anglia, the ornate decorative bracing of Cheshire and Lancashire with its quatfoils and lozenges, the plain functional bracing of a Yorkshire barn. Same structural problem, very different answers, and the answers are stylistic signatures as legible as handwriting. Then, when the framing was cut and fitted and marked and taken apart and hauled to the site, came the day everyone had been waiting for. The raising is the single most demanding operation in the whole process, and it cannot be done by a small crew. A fully assembled cross frame, 2 posts, a tie beam, braces, sometimes a full truss, is a rigid object weighing anywhere from several hundred kilograms to well over a ton, and it must be lifted from flat on the ground to vertical in one movement without dropping it, and then held there while it's pegged to its neighbours. The technique used across medieval and later Europe is essentially the same one documented in American barn raisings into the 20th century. The frame's feet are located at the sill so they can't slide, then the top is lifted first by hand, then by long forked poles called pike poles as it rises beyond reach, with ropes and men on the far side to control it and stop it going past vertical and straight over the other way. Every hand available pushes, someone senior calls the timing. This is why raising was a community event, and the social structure around it is well documented in later periods and strongly implied in medieval sources. You could not hire enough labour for one afternoon of extreme effort. You called in obligation. Neighbours came, and their attendance was reciprocal. You would go to theirs. The village turned out, the frame went up over a day or two, and afterwards the householder fed everyone and provided ale, generously, because that was the actual currency of the transaction. Building accounts and manorial records show food and drink as a substantial line item in construction costs, and in some contexts the drink is explicitly the payment. The raising was simultaneously a construction operation, a social obligation being called in, and a party. Once each frame stood, it was held temporarily with props, raking shores of scrap timber nailed or lashed to hold it plumb, until the longitudinal members went on. Wall plates ran along the tops of the posts tying frame to frame, purlins ran along the roof slopes, and as each longitudinal timber dropped into its housings and was pegged, the building stopped being a row of separate frames and became one rigid box. That transition is dramatic. A propped frame is a wobbling liability. A frame with its plates and purlins in and pegged home is a structure you could hang from. Adjustment happened constantly, with a commander, a huge wooden mallet, sometimes swung two-handed like a maul, used to persuade joints closed, knock frames plumb, and drive stubborn tenons home. A plumb bob on a cord checked verticals. Diagonals were measured with a cord to check for square, and where something didn't quite fit, a man with a chisel went up and made it fit because the frame had been cut on the ground weeks earlier, and green oak does not sit still. The pegs went in last, driven from a ladder or from the frame itself, and each one was left long, protruding an inch or two, so it could be driven further later if the joint loosened, which is why the pegs on old buildings stick out unevenly rather than sitting flush. Not sloppiness, maintenance access. Then the ends were often trimmed, or not, depending on how much the carpenter cared and how high up the joint was. And at the end of it, standing on a plinth of local stone, was a skeleton, a rigid oak cage, jointed, pegged, braced and open to the sky and the wind on every side, with not one wall or roof surface anywhere on it. The expensive part was finished. The house had not yet begun. Chapter 5. Cruck, box frame, and the regional argument. 2 carpenters in 14th century England, working 80 miles apart, would build you a house of the same size for the same money out of the same oak, and the 2 buildings would be structurally unrelated, not stylistically different. Structurally, conceptually, load path and all different, to the point that one of them has walls that carry the roof, and the other has a roof that doesn't need walls at all. This is the great divide in English vernacular building, and it runs along a line you can still trace across the country today. Start with the stranger of the 2, because it's the older idea and the harder one to picture. A cruck frame is built from pairs of large curved timbers, blades, that run in one continuous member from near ground level all the way up to the ridge, leaning together and meeting at the apex like hands pressed together. Each pair is a cruck truss. The blades carry the ridge and the purlins directly, which means the roof load travels down the curve of the blade and into the ground without passing through the wall at all. The wall, in a true cruck building, is not structural. It is a screen. You could, in principle, remove it entirely and the roof would stay up. That's the conceptual leap that makes crucks genuinely alien to modern eyes. It is a building where the roof and the frame are the same object, and the walls are optional infill hung between them. Think of it less as a house with a roof, and more as a series of enormous arches with cladding. The timber itself is the extraordinary part. A cruck blade is a single curved oak, and the pairs are almost always cut from the same tree. The trunk split lengthwise down the middle to produce two mirror image halves, so that the two blades of a truss are a matched pair with identical curvature, the way a butterfly's wings match. Building historians can confirm this on surviving frames because the grain patterns mirror across the pair, which means every cruck truss in England represents one specific tree, deliberately selected for its bend, felled, cleft down its length, and stood up in two pieces facing each other. A 5-truss cruck barn is 5 trees, each one chosen by eye by a man walking through woodland looking for a particular shape, and those trees were not easy to come by, which is a large part of the cruck story. You need a substantial oak with a pronounced, even sweeping curve, the kind produced by a tree that grew leaning, or one with a natural elbow where trunk becomes limb. Hedgerow and wood pasture oaks with room to spread produce these. Dense forest oaks growing straight up toward light do not. So cruck construction depends on a particular kind of landscape, and as suitable curved timber became scarcer through the later medieval period, the technique became harder to sustain. One of several reasons it declines while box framing continues. Now the distribution, which is one of the most striking maps in English architectural history. Crucks are overwhelmingly western and northern. Herefordshire, Worcestershire, Shropshire, Warwickshire, Gloucestershire, Wales. The West Midlands generally, up through Lancashire and Yorkshire, and into Cumbria down into Devon, and parts of the southwest, and they are almost entirely absent from the east and southeast, essentially none in Kent, Sussex, Essex, Norfolk or Suffolk, and none in London. The distribution was mapped in detail through the 20th century, most comprehensively by N.W. Alcock, whose catalogue of English cruck buildings ran to thousands of examples and made the pattern undeniable. There is a line, imprecise, wobbling, argued over, running roughly from the Solent up through the Midlands to the North Sea coast, and east of it the cruck effectively does not exist. Nobody has fully explained why. The honest answer, which I like a great deal more than a confident wrong one, is that there are several plausible causes and the profession has not settled on a hierarchy among them. Timber availability is one, different woodland regimes producing different tree shapes. Cultural transmission is another. Carpentry was learned by apprenticeship, and traditions propagate geographically through who trained whom, so a technique can simply fail to cross a region, because nobody carried it there. Wealth is a third, since the east and southeast were richer earlier, and adopted more elaborate framing sooner. Building type is a fourth, because the eastern tradition was more urban, and crucks work badly in towns. All four are probably true at once, in varying proportions, and anyone who tells you the answer is definitely one of them is having you on. The eastern alternative is the box frame, and it's the one that looks like what most people picture when they hear Tudor. Here the walls are structural, vertical posts standing on a sill beam, tied at the top by a wall plate, braced diagonally, forming a rigid rectangular box. On top of that box sits a separate roof structure, rafters, purlins, sometimes trusses, which bears down on the wall plates. Walls carry roof. Roof sits on walls. It is the conventional arrangement, the one that survived into modern building, and the reason it won is that it is enormously more flexible than the cruck. Consider the constraints a cruck imposes. The blades curve inward as they rise, so the useful width of the room narrows sharply toward the ceiling, and headroom at the walls is poor. You cannot stand upright near the outside wall of a cruck house. Adding an upper floor is awkward because the floor joists have to land somewhere on a curving member. Widening the building means finding bigger curved trees which barely exist, and building upward at all fights the geometry. A box frame has none of these problems. It goes up in stories as easily as it goes along in bays. It gives full headroom to the wall. It accepts a floor at any height you like. It can be built to any width you can span. And critically, it can be built tall and narrow on a cramped urban plot, with a shop below and chambers above, which is exactly what the commercial towns of the east and southeast needed, and exactly what the Kruk cannot do. That urban logic produces the most recognisable feature of late medieval townscapes, the jetty. A jetty is an upper floor that projects out beyond the wall below it, achieved by running the first floor joists past the face of the ground floor wall and standing the upper story's sill beam on their protruding ends. Stack 2 or 3 of these and each story oversails the one beneath, so the building leans out over the street, and if the buildings opposite do the same, the upper floors approach each other overhead until the street below is in permanent shadow. The Shambles in York does this. So does the Rose in Chester, in its own way, and streets in Rouen, Troyes, Strasbourg, and half the surviving old quarters of northern Europe. Why jetty at all? The explanations are numerous, and the argument has been running for a century. More floor area upstairs without paying more ground rent on a plot taxed by street frontage. Plausible, and probably a real factor in dense towns. Structural advantage: the cantilever joist ends are loaded by the wall above, which counterbalances the load of the floor within, and reduces sagging in the middle of a long joist span. Practical: the projecting jetty throws rainwater clear of the wall below. Constructional: it lets you use shorter posts, one story at a time, rather than sourcing trees tall enough to run the full height. And display, straightforwardly, because a deep jetty with a carved Bessemer beam across its face is expensive, and everyone walking down the street can see it. All of these appear in the literature, and most of them are probably correct simultaneously. Between Kruk and box it's the third great type, and it's the oldest and grandest of the three, the aisled hall. Here the problem being solved is span. If you want a wide interior, a great hall, a large barn, and you cannot span the full width with a single tie beam, you put rows of freestanding posts inside the building, dividing it lengthwise into a tall central nave and lower side aisles, exactly as a church does. The internal posts, called arcade posts, carry arcade plates running the length of the building, and the roof frames onto those. Aisled construction descends directly from the great timber halls of the early medieval world and appears across northern Europe from the migration period onward. The excavated royal complex at Yevering in Northumberland, the Danish Viking Age halls at Trelleborg-type fortresses, and the enormous Wealden and Essex barns all belong to the same structural family. The finest survivors are staggering. Great Coxwell Barn in Oxfordshire, a Cistercian Grange barn of the 13th century, runs about 152 feet long with aisled construction and stone walls. William Morris called it the finest piece of architecture in England, which for a man surrounded by cathedrals is a considerable claim. Harmondsworth Great Barn near Heathrow, built for Winchester College in the 1420s, is even longer at around 190 feet, and its interior, dendrochronologically dated still with the vast majority of its original timber, is a forest of oak posts receding into gloom. The problem with aisled halls in a house, as opposed to a barn, is those internal posts. They stand in the middle of your hall, exactly where you want to put a table, a fire, and a lord. The entire late medieval evolution of English open hall design is essentially a series of increasingly clever attempts to get rid of them. The base Kruk, where curved blades rise from the wall to a collar and eliminate the arcade posts at the lower level while keeping them above. The hammerbeam roof, which brackets inward from the walls in stages so that each step reduces the span until the remainder can be crossed, producing the astonishing ceiling of Westminster Hall. Completed in the 1390s by carpenter Hugh Herland for Richard II, spanning roughly 68 feet clear with no internal support, and still the largest medieval timber roof in northern Europe. The crown post and king post and queen post roofs, the arch-braced collar truss, the various purlin arrangements, clasped through but, all represent the same underlying competition: how to get the roof to stand up while putting as little as possible in the room below it, and their distributions are regional too, so that a crown post roof says southeast England, while a through purlin roof with principal rafters says north and west, and the type of roof is often a better regional indicator than the walls, which is the thing worth holding on to here. These are not decorative preferences. A Kruk house, a box-framed jettied townhouse, and an aisled hall are three fundamentally different structural theories about how a building should stand up, and they coexisted in the same country, in the same century, built by men with the same tools and the same wood. Vernacular architecture was never one tradition. It was a set of regional dialects learned by apprenticeship, transmitted along the roads that carpenters actually walked, and stopping abruptly wherever those roads did. Chapter 6. Wattle, daub, and what was actually in the walls. So you have a rigid oak cage standing on a stone plinth, open to the sky and the weather on every side, and now you need walls. Not structural walls, the frame handles that, but something to fill the roughly rectangular holes between the posts, studs, rails and braces. Something cheap, something local, something that keeps the wind out and holds heat in, and can be made by anyone in the household without a specialist. What medieval Europe reached for, almost universally, was mud. Wattle and daub is the technique, and it is genuinely ancient. The basic principle of a woven armature plastered with earth appears in Neolithic contexts across Europe and the Near East, and it was still being used to build houses in parts of Britain in the 19th century and in parts of the world today. It survived 9,000 years because it works, costs nothing, and requires no tools you don't already own. The wattle is the woven part. Into each panel of the frame the carpenter has already cut provision. A row of holes bored along the underside of the upper rail, and a continuous groove, a stave groove, chiselled along the top of the lower rail. Vertical rods called staves are cut slightly long, sprung into place with their upper ends in the holes and their lower ends in the groove, and spaced perhaps 4 to 6 inches apart. Once you have that row of vertical staves standing in the opening, you weave horizontal rods in and out of them, alternating in front and behind, working from the bottom up, packing each course tight against the last. The result is a stiff basketwork membrane filling the panel, and if that sounds like basketry, that's because it is exactly basketry, at architectural scale, and it was very likely the same people doing both. The material is coppice, and specifically hazel wherever hazel grew, because hazel rods split, bend and twist without breaking. In a way almost nothing else matches. A hazel rod of 7 or 8 years' growth can be bent double and twisted along its length without snapping, a property exploited constantly in hurdle making, where the rods at the ends of a hurdle are literally twisted into rope-like fibres to turn a corner. Willow, ash, oak laths riven thin, elm, and whatever else was to hand all appear in the archaeological record, and in stone-poor, hazel-poor regions you find reed bundles, straw ropes and sedge doing the same job. But hazel is the classic, and its dominance is one of the reasons hazel coppice was so extensively managed across medieval England. Every house in the parish needed a bundle of rods every few years, and the coppice supplied it forever. Then the daub, which is where things get earthy in both senses. Daub is a composite of 3 functional components, and understanding it as engineering rather than mud makes the whole thing click. You need a binder, clay, which holds everything together and provides plasticity. You need an aggregate, sand, gravel, crushed chalk, or whatever inert granular material the local ground provides, which reduces shrinkage and stops the clay cracking as it dries. And you need fibre, chopped straw, hay, animal hair, flax, reed, which provides tensile reinforcement, distributes shrinkage stresses, and stops the whole panel splitting apart as it dries. It is, structurally, reinforced concrete's illiterate great-grandparent, a brittle matrix with a ductile reinforcement running through it. And yes, there was dung in it, frequently. Analyses of daub samples from excavated and standing buildings across Britain and northern Europe repeatedly identify cattle dung as a component, and it's not there out of desperation or ignorance. Cow dung is, functionally, pre-digested plant fibre suspended in a colloidal organic matrix, which means it delivers finely divided fibre reinforcement, improves workability, adds organic binders that increase adhesion, and, because of its fibrous protein content, noticeably improves water resistance in the finished surface. Traditional earth-building traditions worldwide independently arrived at animal dung as an additive, from West Africa to India to Ireland, which is the sort of convergence that tells you it's doing real work. Your wall was partly manure, and it was manure for a reason. Other additives appear regionally and locally. Animal blood in some traditions as a binder, urine as a plasticizer and to break down clay, lime where lime was cheap, which begins to shift the material toward a genuine plaster. Ash, chopped bracken, horsehair especially, since it's long, strong and abundant wherever horses are. Mixing was done by foot. You dumped clay, aggregate, fibre, dung and water into a shallow pit or onto a hard-standing area and trod it, often with cattle driven round in a circle to do the work, which is exactly how cob was mixed in the West Country into living memory. The mixture had to be worked until it was homogeneous and of the right consistency, judged entirely by feel. Too wet and it slumps out of the panel, too dry and it won't bond to the wattle or to itself. There was no recipe, no measured proportion, no standard. There was a person who had done it before, standing in a pit of mud up to the ankles, deciding by hand whether it was ready. Application was equally hands-on. Daub was thrown, pushed and pressed onto the wattle from both sides simultaneously where possible, so the material squeezed through the gaps in the weave and keyed onto itself from front and back, locking the wattle inside a continuous mass of earth. You work it in with fingers and palms, force it into every interstice, and then bring both faces up flush with the frame. A panel might take 2 or 3 inches of total thickness. It was done in stages, a first coat pressed in and allowed to firm up, then a finishing coat to bring it flat, because a single thick application cracks catastrophically as it shrinks, and it shrinks. This is the material's fundamental behaviour and the source of every problem it causes. Clay loses volume as its water evaporates, so a panel that was flush when applied ends up marginally smaller, pulling away from the timber at its edges and opening a hairline gap all the way round. That gap is a draft, and worse, a water path. The fibre in the mix reduces this dramatically but doesn't eliminate it, and the timber frame is simultaneously shrinking and twisting on its own schedule, so the two materials are moving relative to each other for years. The answer was render, and specifically lime. Lime plaster, quicklime slaked with water, mixed with sand and often hair, spread over the daub and lapped across the timber, seals the joints, sheds water, and crucially is vapour permeable. Lime lets moisture pass through and evaporate rather than trapping it against the wood, which is exactly what you want with an oak frame that must be allowed to dry. It is also mildly self-healing. Free lime in the plaster dissolves in water passing through a hairline crack and recrystallises as calcium carbonate, closing the crack. A lime-washed wall, refreshed each year with a fresh brushed coat, maintains itself, which raises the point about the black and white thing, and I want to be careful here, because this is where a great deal of nonsense circulates. Many, probably most, medieval timber-framed buildings in England were rendered over entirely, timber and panels alike, and finished with lime wash, so that the frame was invisible from outside. The exposed timber look, with dark beams contrasting against white panels, is genuine in some regions and periods, particularly in the wealthy display framing of the West Midlands and the close-studded facades of East Anglia, where the timber itself was the ostentation. But the pitch-black beams you see on so many Tudor buildings are frequently Victorian. 19th century restorers and 20th century owners stripped render off and painted the exposed oak with tar or black paint to make it look properly ancient. Untreated medieval oak weathers to a soft silvery grey. The high-contrast monochrome look is substantially a Victorian aesthetic project, applied retroactively to buildings that never had it, and in some cases the tar sealed the timber, trapped moisture, and did real damage. Regional infill varied enormously beyond wattle. In brick-producing regions from the 15th century, nogging, brick infill laid in the panels, often in herringbone patterns, replaced daub and became a status marker in its own right. In stone country, panels were filled with rubble and mortar. In parts of the north and west, whole walls were built of cob, earth, straw and aggregate built up in courses without any frame at all, in raised lifts each allowed to dry before the next, with walls 2 or 3 feet thick. Devon has thousands of surviving cob buildings. The old builder's rule for cob is that it needs a good hat and good boots, meaning a broad overhanging roof and a stone plinth, and given both it lasts indefinitely. In Scandinavia and the Alps and the forested East, none of this applied at all because those regions had enough timber to build solid log walls and skipped the infill problem entirely. The performance of a wattle and daub wall is better than you'd assume and worse than you'd hope. Earth has genuine thermal mass, so a daub panel evens out temperature swings, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night. It is hygroscopic, buffering humidity by absorbing moisture from the air and releasing it. It is essentially fireproof in itself, which matters. But its raw insulating value is modest. A 2-inch panel is not a modern cavity wall, and its real weakness is the edges, gaps and junctions where wind gets in. Medieval interiors were drafty not because the walls were bad, but because the walls had 100 linear meters of shrinking timber-to-earth joint in them. So maintenance was permanent. Redaubing cracked panels, patching where rain had washed material out, renewing lime wash, replacing panels entirely where they had failed. This was ordinary seasonal work done by the householder, not a specialist, alongside thatching repairs and everything else. Manorial court records finding tenants for ruinous holdings are frequently finding them for exactly this. Walls unmaintained, daub fallen out, the house open to the weather. The wall was not a finished object. It was a surface that required attention roughly as often as a garden does. And the material's greatest advantage is the one that makes it nearly invisible archaeologically. It returns to the ground completely. Abandoned, a daub wall dissolves in a few decades of rain into a low spread of clay, indistinguishable from soil, leaving nothing but occasional fragments, usually the ones accidentally fired in a house blaze, which bake into something like crude pottery and preserve, beautifully, the impressions of the hazel rods that were inside them. Excavators find burnt daub fragments with the negative shapes of wattlework pressed into them, and from those impressions you can measure the diameter of rods that rotted away 8 centuries ago, Chapter 7. The roof that weighed more than the house. The frame cost you a woodland. The walls cost you a week and some mud. The roof is about to cost you more than both, take longer than either, and be the single thing most likely to kill you. Start with the fact that puts the whole chapter in proportion. A thatched roof on a medieval house was commonly a foot to 2 feet thick, laid in overlapping layers, and it weighed a great deal. Water-reed thatch at full depth runs somewhere around 30 to 40 kilograms per square metre, once you account for the fixings and the inevitable moisture in the outer layers, and a modest house with 100 square metres of roof surface is therefore carrying something in the region of 3 to 4 tons of dead vegetation above the family's heads. The entire oak frame beneath it, the posts, the ties, the braces, the thing that took 100 trees, was in large part a machine for holding up grass, and it had to be thick, because thatch does not work the way a tiled roof works. A tile sheds water off its surface. Thatch sheds water through its outer layer and down the length of the stems, which means the mechanism depends entirely on pitch and depth. Every stalk is laid butt-end down, angled steeply, so water entering the surface runs down the stem and drips onto the stem below rather than penetrating inward. The rule that follows is absolute. Thatch demands a steep roof. 50 degrees is the practical minimum, and traditional thatched roofs commonly run to 55 degrees or more. Drop below about 45 and water starts tracking sideways into the coat instead of down it, and the roof rots from within. That single physical constraint is why medieval houses have those enormously tall, steep roofs that dominate the elevation. The roof is often taller than the wall beneath it. It's not an aesthetic, it's drainage. The material's divided by geography with the usual medieval ruthlessness. Water-reed, Phragmites australis, cut from fens and marshes, is the aristocrat, hard, hollow, slow to rot, and capable of lasting 50 to 70 years or more on a well-pitched roof. Norfolk was and remains the great English source, and reed thatch was a regional privilege rather than a national norm. Wheat straw was the common material across the arable lowlands, laid either as long straw, which is threshed straw-dressed and laid so that both butts and ends show on the surface, or as combed wheat reed, a West Country technique where the straw is combed to align the stems and laid butt-end out like reed. Straw lasts perhaps 20 to 30 years for combed wheat, 15 to 25 for long straw. Heather, broom, sedge, rushes, bracken, and turf all appear regionally. Heather on the moorland fringes of Scotland and northern England, sedge as a ridging material almost everywhere, turf in the treeless north and west and across Iceland and the Northern Isles. And here's the detail that changes how you should think about the material. The straw was a different plant. Medieval and early modern wheat varieties were tall, land races growing to 4 or 5 feet, with long, tough, thick-walled stems because nobody had yet bred them for anything else. 20th century plant breeding deliberately produced short-strawed wheat to maximise grain yield and resist lodging. which is agriculturally sensible and catastrophic for thatchers, since modern straw is short, brittle, and useless for roofing. Working thatchers today source straw from specially grown heritage varieties, cut with a reaper binder rather than a combine, because a combine harvester smashes the stems. The material had to be revived deliberately after the crop that produced it was bred out of existence. The harvest mattered as much as the species. Straw for thatching was cut, bound, and stored dry, and the cutting was timed so the stems were mature but not brittle. Reed was cut in winter after the leaf had fallen, from frozen or drained fen, and reed cutting was a genuine seasonal industry with its own workforce, its own tools, and its own economics. The Norfolk Broads and the Somerset Levels supported reed harvesting on a commercial scale for centuries, and the reed was traded and shipped like any other commodity. Laying it is a specialist trade and always was. The roof structure gives the thatcher his fixing points. Rafters running from wall plate to ridge, and across them either battens or, in older and rougher work, a matting of brushwood, wattle, or turf laid directly on the rafters as a bed. Onto this the thatcher works upward from the eaves in horizontal courses, each course of bundles laid so its butts overlap the course below by a large proportion, often 3/4 or more, which is why a 2-foot thick roof might be built of stems only 3 feet long. The overlap is the waterproofing. Fixing methods are regionally distinct and archaeologically interesting. Spars or brooches, hazel rods a couple of feet long, sharpened at both ends and twisted in the middle into a giant staple, are driven through the new course into the layer beneath, pinning it. Horizontal hazel rods called liggers or sways run along the courses and are pinned down by the spars, spreading the load. In older and poorer work and across much of the north and west, the thatch was instead tied down with ropes of twisted straw or heather, weighted at the eaves with stones hung on the rope ends, a technique still visible in surviving Hebridean black houses and in Icelandic and Faroes building, and entirely necessary where the wind would otherwise remove your roof in a single night. The ridge is the vulnerable point, because there the stems change direction and water can get in at the join. It's finished separately, usually with a flexible material, sedge or straw bent over the apex, and pinned with decorative patterns of liggers and crossbars, which is where the ornamental scalloped and diamond patterns on English thatch come from. That decoration is a signature. Individual thatchers had recognisable ridge patterns, and in some regions you could identify the maker of a roof from the ground. Then, the part that makes thatch archaeologically priceless. It was laid over an open hearth, and the smoke went straight up through it. Before chimneys, the fire burned on a hearth in the middle of the hall floor, and the smoke rose into the roof space, filtered slowly out through the thatch, and coated everything on the way. Over decades, this produced smoke blackening, a hard, glossy, tarry deposit of soot and resin on the rafters, purlins, and the underside of the thatch itself. And it is a permanent, unambiguous physical record. Building historians use it constantly. If a roof timber is smoke blackened, the building had an open hearth beneath it. If it is blackened only on one side, or blackening stops at a certain line, you can reconstruct where the smoke bay was and where the fire sat. If a timber is not blackened in a building that otherwise is, that timber was inserted after the chimney arrived. Surveys of surviving medieval houses across England have used smoke blackening to date the transition from open hall to chimney with real precision, and it also tells us something delightful. Buildings routinely retain their original base coat of medieval thatch, buried beneath centuries of subsequent recoating, because thatchers traditionally strip only the weathered top layer and rethatch over the sound material below. Some English roofs contain thatch laid in the 15th century, still there, still doing its job, blackened by fires that went out 500 years ago. It has been radiocarbon dated. There is medieval straw over people's heads in Devon right now. That accumulation also explains why old thatched roofs look so bulky and soft-edged. Layer over layer over layer, each new coat adding thickness, until the roof rounds out over its own eaves, and the depth exceeds anything a thatcher would apply new. But the smoke had a second function that nobody planned and everybody benefited from. It preserved the roof. Soot deposits are mildly antifungal and insecticidal. The constant warm dry updraft kept the thatch and timber dry from beneath, and the tarry coating deterred the insects and rot that otherwise attack straw. Open hearth halls had roofs that lasted, and the arrival of the chimney, which is unambiguously better for human lungs, removed a preservative the buildings had been quietly relying on. Now the obvious problem, which is that you have 3 tons of dry grass suspended over an open fire, thatch burns. Not readily when wet and well maintained, since a compressed thatch surface is denser than people assume, and a dropped spark will often smoulder out, but catastrophically once established. And worse, it burns from within and spreads across contiguous roofs faster than anyone can respond. Medieval urban fire history is essentially a history of thatch. London banned it in 1212, in the aftermath of a devastating fire, with an ordinance requiring roofs to be tiled, shingled or covered with lead or boards, and specifying that existing thatch be plastered over. One of the earliest building regulations in English law, and like most building regulations, imperfectly enforced and repeatedly reissued. Similar measures appear across European towns through the 13th and 14th centuries, and the fact that they were reissued so often tells you exactly how well the first attempt went. When the Great Fire came in 1666, it was tar, timber and pitch as much as thatch, but the principle had been understood for 400 years, which pushes the wealthy and the urban toward the alternatives, and each has its own economics. Wooden shingles, riven oak, split radially, tapered and pegged or nailed in overlapping courses, were common across medieval Europe, and the standard roofing for many English churches and buildings before tile spread. They're light. They can be made from coppice-scale timber, and riven oak weathers well because no fibres are cut. They also burn, which limited their urban future. Clay tile transformed roofing where clay and fuel were available. Plain tiles, roughly 10 by 6 inches, hung on riven laths by a nib or a peg, in overlapping courses. The standard English medieval roof tile is remarkably close to the modern one. Tile is fireproof, durable for a century or more, and crucially allows a shallower pitch than thatch, which means less timber in the roof structure. Tile production became a substantial medieval industry with its own regulation. The price and dimensions of roofing tiles were controlled by statute in England in the 15th century, which tells you the market was large enough to need policing. Stone slate, thin split sandstone or limestone, roofs the buildings of the Cotswolds, the Pennines, Purbeck and every region with a fissile stone, and it is heavy. A stone slate roof can weigh double a tiled one, requiring a substantially stronger frame beneath. It's laid in graded courses, largest at the eaves, smallest at the ridge, which is both structurally sensible and quietly beautiful. Lead was the material of cathedrals, castles and the very rich. Cast in sand into sheets, laid over boarding on low-pitched or flat roofs, joined with rolls and welts, lead is essentially permanent, allows near-flat roofs impossible in any other medieval material, and is fantastically expensive. It is also recyclable, which is why the roofs of the monasteries dissolved in the 1530s vanished so quickly. The lead was stripped, melted and sold, and the buildings, suddenly open to English weather, collapsed within a generation. Fountains Abbey and Rievaulx are ruined substantially because someone took the roof for scrap, and where nothing else existed, turf. Cut sods laid grass down over a birch bark membrane, common across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic settlements, insulating superbly, weighing enormously, and requiring occasional grazing. Icelandic turf houses represent the extreme end of building with whatever the ground provides, and they were still being built into the 20th century. The maintenance burden, whatever the material, was constant. Thatch needs the ridge renewed every 10 to 15 years, even when the main coat is sound. It needs patching where birds pull material out for nests, where squirrels and rats burrow in, where a slipped course lets water track. Wire netting is a modern answer to a medieval problem. Before it, thatchers relied on tight packing, and the birds won a certain percentage. Tiles slip and need rebedding, shingles curl, lead creeps downhill under its own weight over centuries, and periodically has to be lifted and relaid. So the roof was the most expensive part of the building, the most skilled to make, the most demanding to maintain, and the most likely to be the reason your house and your neighbour's house ceased to exist on the same afternoon. And it was also the part that made everything else possible, because the frame and the walls and the floor were all, in the end, arrangements for keeping something dry underneath a very large pile of carefully angled plants. Chapter 8. The Hall, the Hearth, and the Hole in the Roof. Step through the door of a 14th century peasant house, and the first thing that hits you is not the dark, not the smoke, not the smell. It's that there is no upstairs, no corridor, no rooms. There is one enormous space open all the way to the rafters, with a fire burning on the floor in the middle of it, and everything anyone in that household does happens inside it. The open hall is the fundamental medieval domestic form, and it runs from the humblest cottage to the grandest royal palace with the same basic logic scaled up or down. A single volume, open to the roof, with a hearth in the centre. Westminster Hall and a Warwickshire peasant's cottage are the same idea at wildly different budgets. The difference is that in one of them Richard II is eating swan under a hammerbeam roof by Hugh Herland, and in the other a family of 6 is eating pottage under a rafter their grandfather cut. The hearth is the whole point, and it needs to be understood as the reason the room is shaped the way it is. A medieval open hearth was physically almost nothing. A patch of the floor, sometimes ringed with stones, sometimes a shallow clay pad, sometimes a raised platform of tile or stone in later and grander examples, on which the fire simply burned. Excavated peasant houses show them as burnt patches of hardened, reddened clay in the middle of the floor. No fireplace, no flue, no back wall. The fire is in the room with you, and it radiates in every direction at once, which is precisely why it sits in the centre. A fire against a wall throws half its heat into the wall, and a household that cannot afford to waste fuel puts the fire where all of the heat lands on somebody. Fuel varied enormously by region and by wealth, and the difference between them was a difference in quality of life. Wood was best, and access to it depended entirely on those Estoverites we've already met. Charcoal burned hot and nearly smokeless, but was a manufactured product with a price. Peat and turf, cut and dried in summer, burned across Ireland, Scotland, the Fens, and the Low Countries with a low, slow, aromatic smoke. Furze and gorse and bracken burned fast and hot, and were the fuel of the very poor, requiring constant feeding. Dried dung appears wherever fuel was scarce, and cattle were not. And sea coal, mineral coal shipped from Newcastle down the east coast to London, was in use in England from the 13th century, burned filthily, and generated complaints about London's air quality that survive in petitions to Edward I in the 1280s, and a royal proclamation restricting its use. The medieval Londoner complaining about the smog was, in a sense, correct, and about 700 years early. The smoke went up. That's the entire ventilation strategy. Hot smoke rises into the open roof space, spreads out under the thatch, cools, and gradually filters out through the roof covering, through gable vents, through a louvre, a timber turret with angled slats set over the hearth in wealthier halls, sometimes with a rotating cowl to keep the wind from blowing back down it, or simply through gaps. The critical consequence is that the smoke layer sits above head height. In a properly proportioned open hall with sufficient height, there is a stratified layer of hot smoke sitting under the roof, and clear air beneath it, and if you stand up you enter the smoke, and if you sit down you don't. Everybody sat down. The furniture and the social conventions of the hall, benches, low stools, sitting at table, are partly a response to the fact that the upper 4 feet of the room was uninhabitable. That said, the smoke was real, and its health effects were real. Paleopathological studies of medieval skeletal populations find evidence consistent with chronic respiratory irritation, and the sinus and lung conditions associated with indoor smoke exposure appear in the record. Eye irritation shows up in medical texts. It was a genuine cost, absorbed as a fact of life the way we absorb traffic noise. Now the layout, because the open hall is not just one undifferentiated box, it has a strong internal geography, and everyone knew where they stood in it. The standard English arrangement, visible in hundreds of surviving buildings and reconstructible from thousands of excavations, runs along the length of the building with the hall in the middle and functional ends at either extremity. At one end sits the screen's passage, a corridor across the width of the building formed by a timber screen, with the front and back doors opening into it opposite each other. This is a clever piece of design doing 3 things at once. It creates a draft lobby, so opening the door doesn't blow the fire across the room. It provides a through passage for moving goods, animals, and people across the house without walking through the hall. And it separates the hall from the service end, because on the far side of the screen, in a house of any status, lie 2 doors leading to the buttery and the pantry. The buttery is for drink, the word comes from butts, meaning barrels, not butter, and the pantry is for bread and dry goods, from panis. In larger establishments, a passage between them leads back to a detached kitchen, sited separately precisely because kitchens burn down. At the other end of the hall, at the upper end, sits the household head. In a manor house, this is the dais, a raised platform running across the width, with the high table on it and often a large window lighting it, and behind the dais a door or 2 leading to the private chambers, the solar, an upper private room, and below it sometimes a parlour or storage. The solar is where the family retreated for privacy, and its existence is one of the earliest signs of the long medieval drift away from communal living. So the room has a directional hierarchy built into its plan, high end and low end. Above the salt and below it, the salt cellar on the high table being an actual physical marker of rank, and the phrase surviving into modern English long after the practice died. Where you sat in a hall was a public statement of your standing, renewed at every meal, and the architecture enforced it without anyone having to say a word. Down at the humbler end of society, the same logic operated in cruder form. And this is where the medieval house becomes genuinely startling to modern sensibilities, because a great many people lived in a longhouse, a single long building under one roof, divided crosswise into a domestic end for the family and a byre at the other end for the cattle. Not a barn attached to the house. The same room, or at most separated by a low partition, with the animals standing in a lower section, often with a drainage channel cut into the sloping floor to carry the effluent out through a hole in the gable wall. Longhouses are documented archaeologically across Britain, Ireland, Brittany, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, and they persisted in parts of Wales, the Scottish Highlands, Devon and Ireland into the 19th century, and in a few cases the 20th. Dartmoor is full of them. The abandoned medieval settlement at Hound Tor has excavated longhouses with clearly identifiable byre ends, drains and cross passages, and the reasoning was not indifference to hygiene, it was thermodynamics and security. A cow generates something in the region of 500 to 1000 watts of body heat continuously, so 4 or 5 cattle in the lower end of a building are a substantial heat source, running all winter for free. They also represent the household's entire capital, and cattle raiding was a real and constant risk in the border regions and the Celtic West. You do not leave your savings account outdoors. The trade-off was the atmosphere, and there is no polite way around it. The smell of a byre-end longhouse in February, damp cattle, dung, urine, wet straw, wood smoke, unwashed people, cooking, and whatever was hanging in the rafters, would be, to a modern nose, overwhelming. Medieval noses were calibrated differently, and the evidence suggests it was not considered pleasant so much as normal, though there is enough medieval commentary on bad smells, and enough effort spent on herbs, rushes, and sweet-smelling strewing plants to know that people noticed and minded. The floor was earth, beaten, rammed, sometimes mixed with lime or ash, or ox blood to harden it, occasionally clay-lined, and in wealthier houses laid with tile or stone flags. But for most people, for most of the Middle Ages, the floor of the house was the ground with the vegetation removed and the surface compacted by feet. Over it went strewing, rushes, straw, or in better households cut herbs and sweet flag, laid loose over the floor to absorb dirt and provide insulation and softness. Erasmus wrote a famous and thoroughly disgusted passage in the early 16th century about English floors strewn with rushes, the bottom layer left undisturbed for 20 years, harbouring spittle, vomit, dog urine, scraps of fish and worse, and while Erasmus was a fastidious continental humanist with an agenda, the practice of laying fresh rushes over old was certainly real. Better houses swept and replaced. Poorer ones did not, or not often. Sleeping arrangements were communal to a degree that modern readers find hard to process. In a single-room house, the family slept in the hall, on benches, on pallets of straw, on the floor near the banked fire, under whatever coverings existed, and frequently in the same bed. Beds were expensive and appear in wills as significant bequests. A bed with its hangings and bedding could be the most valuable item in a modest household's inventory, worth more than the livestock, and was left to a named heir with the specificity you'd use for land. Servants slept in the hall after the family withdrew, which is one reason the withdrawal to the solar mattered so much. It was the only privacy in the building. Furniture was sparse, heavy, and multi-purpose. A trestle table, boards on collapsible supports, set up for meals and taken down after, which is why a hall could be a dining room and then a dormitory within an hour. Benches and forms rather than chairs, since chairs were status objects, and a hall might contain exactly one, occupied by the person entitled to it. Chests for everything. Storage, seating, and the transport of goods when the household moved, which for aristocratic families was constantly. Cupboards for display of plate. Very little else. Lighting was a genuine problem and a genuine expense. Beeswax candles were beautiful, clean burning, and priced for churches and the rich. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, were the ordinary domestic light. They smoked, they smelled of what they were, and they needed constant snuffing as the wick charred. Cheapest of all was the rushlight, a peeled rush dipped repeatedly in fat, held at an angle in a pincer-like iron holder, burning with a small clear flame for perhaps 20 to 30 minutes per rush. Making rushlights was a household task, done in quantity, and a family might get through hundreds in a winter. Beyond that there was the fire, and beyond that there was going to bed, which is a large part of why medieval sleep patterns look strange to us. Which brings us to the Great Change, arriving gradually from the 14th century and accelerating through the 15th and 16th, the chimney. A masonry stack with a flue, drawing smoke out of the room entirely, allowed a fire against a wall, which allowed a ceiling, which allowed a floor above it, which allowed the great hall to be subdivided into rooms. And once you can build rooms, you can build privacy, and privacy restructures the family. W.G. Hoskins named the period roughly 1570 to 1640 the Great Rebuilding, for exactly this reason. And while later scholarship has complicated the timing and shown the process starting earlier and running unevenly by region, the underlying transformation is real. Halls were floored over. Smoke bays, a transitional device where a section of the hall was partitioned off, top to bottom, to funnel smoke up through the roof, appear as an intermediate step in many surviving buildings, and you can date it in the timber, because everything above the new ceiling stopped getting sooty. The smoke-blackened rafters in an English roof, with clean inserted joists below them, are the physical fossil of the moment a family stopped living in one room together and started living in a house with rooms in it. Chapter 9. Floors, doors, windows, and everything that kept the weather out. Everything so far has been the shell, frame, wall, roof, hearth. Now the small things, which is where the actual difference between a survivable winter and a miserable one was decided, and where most of a household's cash money went. Because the paradox of the medieval house is that the timber was expensive, but you got it as a grant. The daub was free, the thatch was harvestable, and then the door cost you a week's wages in ironwork alone. The floor first, since you're standing on it. For the great majority of medieval Europeans, the floor was beaten earth. The ground, cleared of turf, levelled and compacted. But just dirt undersells the craft considerably, because a properly made earth floor is a deliberate composite. The technique was to lay a mixture of clay, sand or fine gravel, and often lime or ash, then ram it hard in thin successive layers, wetting between them until you had a dense, smooth, dust-free surface. Additives appear regionally and consistently. Ox blood, which coagulates and binds the surface into something almost like a hardened polymer. Skim milk, ash, and animal dung again, doing the same fibrin binder work it does in daub. A well-made and well-maintained earth floor is hard enough to sweep, takes a polish underfoot and can last decades. Excavators find them as compacted horizons with distinct wear hollows at thresholds and beside hearths, which is where people actually stood. Over it went the strewing already mentioned, and above that, in better houses from the 13th century, rush matting, plaited rush laid in strips and sewn together to cover a floor, a genuine manufactured product with a trade behind it, and a considerable step up from loose rushes. Then tile. Clay floor tiles, plain and glazed, appear in high status and ecclesiastical buildings from the 12th and 13th centuries, and the great decorated tile pavements of English abbeys, Byland, Cleve, Winchester, represent an industry producing patterned inlaid tiles at scale. Stone flags wherever fissile stone was cheap. Timber boards, riven or sawn, on joists, in upper stories, which is where the jetty and the floor meet, because putting a boarded floor in demands joists, and joists demand a frame designed for them. The floor also had a persistent habit of rising. Occupation debris, repeated strewing, spilled material, and successive resurfacing meant that in continuously occupied buildings, the floor level climbed, sometimes by a foot or more across a few centuries, which is why so many old buildings now have their door sills below the surrounding ground and require a step down into them. That step down into a medieval church or an old cottage isn't the building sinking, it's the world outside rising faster. Now the openings, and here we hit the central problem of medieval building physics. Every hole in your wall is a hole in your wall. Light, air and access all enter by the same routes as cold, rain and thieves, and the entire history of medieval windows and doors is a negotiation between those two facts. Windows were small, high, and unglazed. That's the baseline for ordinary housing throughout the period, and it's worth sitting with how dark it made things. A window in a peasant house was an aperture in the wall, often unframed beyond the timber of the frame itself, sometimes fitted with turned or plain mullions of oak dividing it into narrow lights, and closed by a shutter, not glass. A wooden board, hinged or sliding in a groove, that you opened for light and closed for weather, and the fundamental trade-off is that you could have light, or you could have warmth, and you could not have both. In winter, in bad weather, at night, the shutters were closed and the house was lit by the fire. Between open and shuttered lay a range of translucent materials, and they're wonderful. Oiled cloth, linen soaked in linseed oil or resin stretched on a light frame, passes a soft diffuse light and blocks the wind, and it's cheap enough to be genuinely common. Parchment, similarly oiled, does the same. Horn, which is the star of this list. Cattle horn boiled, split, flattened under pressure, and scraped down to a thin, translucent amber sheet, cut into panes and set in a lattice. Horn is tough, doesn't shatter, and glows warmly when lit from behind. It appears in accounts and inventories across medieval Europe, gave English the word lanthorn for a lantern with horn panes, and was still in use for lanterns centuries later. Glass was for churches, then for the rich, then eventually for everybody, and the trajectory is one of the clearest markers of rising domestic comfort. Medieval window glass was made by the crown method, a blown bubble spun out flat by centrifugal force into a disc, then cut into small quarries, or the cylinder or muff method, where a blown cylinder is cut lengthwise and flattened. Both produce small pieces with irregular thickness, which is why medieval glazing is assembled from diamond or rectangular quarries, held in lead cames and stiffened with iron saddle bars. It was expensive enough that glazed windows were legally treated as removable fixtures rather than part of the building. Aristocratic households took their glass with them when they moved between residences, and there is documented practice of glass being taken down and stored when a house was empty. Records from the 16th century show glass being removed from windows at Alnwick when the household was absent to preserve it. Your windows were furniture. The door was the most heavily invested object in the building, and this is the detail people find hardest to believe until they see a medieval door up close. A proper door was a ledged and braced plank door, vertical oak boards, riven for strength, edge-jointed or rebated, held by horizontal ledges and diagonal braces on the inside, and then reinforced with iron. And the ironwork is the money. Strap hinges running the full width of the door, often decoratively scrolled, forged by a smith from Barstock at considerable labour. Nails by the hundred, each individually hand-forged, clenched over on the inside. A ring handle or drop handle on a decorated backplate. A lock, if you could afford one, which was a handmade mechanism of iron plates, wards and springs, filed by a specialist and a genuine luxury item. Iron was the constraint. Every piece of it was smelted from ore in a bloomery, worked from bloom to bar by hand, and forged to shape by a smith burning charcoal that someone else had spent a week making. The medieval price ratio of iron to almost everything else was brutal, which is why the framing was pegged with oak rather than nailed, why nails were routinely salvaged from demolished buildings, and why a door with substantial ironwork on it announced something about the household to everyone approaching. Church doors survive in numbers because churches could afford the best of it. The great scrolled hinges on Norman and Gothic church doors across England and France are among the finest surviving medieval smithing, and some, at places like Merton and Stillingfleet, carry ironwork of the 12th century still hanging on its original pintles. Security followed the same economics. Locks and keys existed in real variety, warded locks, padlocks, chest locks, but for the ordinary house the fastening was a drawbar, a heavy timber sliding in a socket in the wall and across the back of the door, which is unpickable, immovable from outside and free. The catch is that a drawbar can only be operated from within, so it secures the house at night and does nothing while you're at market, which is precisely why chests had locks and doors often didn't. You secured the valuables rather than the building. The threshold itself carries more weight, culturally, than any other part of the house. It's the boundary between inside and outside, and the medieval mind treated boundaries as dangerous places requiring management. Apotropaic marks, protective symbols cut into timber to ward off harm, cluster overwhelmingly around openings, Doorways, windows, fireplaces and the beams over them. The most common are hexafoils, the six-petalled daisy wheel drawn with a compass, and the interlocking VV, or double V, generally read as Virgo Virginum, a Marian invocation. Also burn marks, deliberate teardrop-shaped scorches made by holding a flame against a beam, found by the thousand in English buildings, and now understood as intentional rather than accidental. Concealed objects turn up too, shoes walled into chimneys and thresholds, dried cats, witch bottles, deposited at exactly the points where something might get in. The building was defended physically and spiritually at the same openings, by the same householder, on the same afternoon. Stairs, where they existed, were often not stairs. Access to a loft or solar in an ordinary house was by ladder, and the fixed staircase is a later luxury. Where medieval stairs do appear, they're frequently a newel stair, a tight spiral around a central post, cheap in floor area, easy to defend, and thoroughly unpleasant to carry anything up. Heating beyond the hearth barely existed, so insulation was doing the work, and the household's approach was to insulate the person rather than the room. Hangings on walls, painted cloths for the middling sort, tapestry for the rich, served as draught-proofing as much as decoration, since a heavy cloth over a wall kills the air movement that makes a room feel cold. Bed curtains were not ornamental. A fully curtained bed is a small insulated tent within the room, holding body heat all night, and the four-poster exists for thermal reasons before aesthetic ones. Layers of wool, furs and shared body heat did the rest. The medieval solution to a cold house was not to heat the house, and the last small thing easy to overlook is that all of this was maintenance permanently. Shutters warp and need rehanging, thresholds wear through, hinges need repinning, earth floors need re-ramming where they hollow, locks seize, rushes need replacing. The medieval house was not an object you bought and inhabited, but a process you conducted continuously, and the household that stopped conducting it found the building failing around them within a very few years, which is exactly the condition those manorial courts kept fining people for. Chapter 10. Fire, Repair, and the Death of a House. So we come to the end of the house, which the medieval world understood far better than we do, because a modern building is designed to last and a medieval one was designed to be kept, and the difference between those two verbs is the whole story of what follows. Start with fire, because fire is what most often finished the job. A medieval town was a dense mass of oak, thatch, straw, tallow, pitch, firewood, and open flames, packed onto plots with shared walls and overhanging jetties that brought upper stories within a few feet of each other across a street. Every household cooked over an open fire, lit its rooms with burning fat, and stored fuel indoors. The wonder is not that towns burned, it's that they didn't burn constantly, and in fact they nearly did. London burned in 1077, 1087, 1132, 1136, 1212, and repeatedly thereafter. The 1212 fire, the one that produced the thatch ban we met earlier, killed a large number of people trapped on London Bridge when the crowd that had crossed to watch the blaze found fire behind them as well as ahead. Winchester, Norwich, Glastonbury, Chichester, Lincoln, Bury St Edmunds, and essentially every other significant English town has a recorded medieval conflagration, and continental towns fared no better. The regulatory response was substantial, and it's genuinely the origin of building control as a legal category. The London Assize of Buildings, associated with Henry Fitzaylwin, London's first mayor, around 1189, set out rules for construction between neighbours in remarkable detail. Party walls of stone were specified at 3 feet thick and 16 feet high, with the cost shared between the adjoining owners. Rules governed guttering, so that rainwater from one roof did not discharge onto another's land, and there were provisions for windows overlooking a neighbour's property. It is recognisably a planning code, and it exists because dense urban timber building generates disputes and disasters in equal measure. The practical firefighting equipment was legally mandated and beautifully simple. Parishes and wards were required to maintain hooks, long poles with iron hooks, sometimes on ropes, used to pull the burning thatch off a roof and drag the roof structure down, creating a fire break by demolishing the building in front of the fire. Also, leather buckets, ladders, and in some ordinances a requirement that householders keep a full barrel of water outside the door in summer. Curfew itself, from couvre-feu, cover the fire, was a fire regulation before it was anything else, an evening bell at which household fires were to be damped down or covered with a curfew, a metal dome placed over the embers to contain sparks while keeping the fire alive until morning. The word we now associate with martial law began as an instruction to put a lid on your fireplace, but most houses didn't burn. Most houses simply required endless attention, and the rhythm of that attention structured the year. Redaubing cracked panels in dry weather, renewing lime wash annually, often at a set season, patching thatch where birds and weather had opened it, and renewing the ridge every decade or so, rehanging shutters, ramming down worn floors, replacing a rotten sill beam, which was a real operation involving jacking or propping the frame, cutting out the failed timber and letting in a new one, a repair so common that surviving buildings are full of replaced sills, and dendrochronology routinely finds ground floor timbers a century or two younger than the frame above them. The house was a body under continuous medical care. The legal pressure behind this was constant. Manorial court rolls across England record tenants presented for allowing their holdings to fall into ruin, with orders to repair by a stated date under penalty, and the recurrence of the same names across successive courts suggests a certain robust indifference on the part of some tenants. Leases specified repairing obligations. The concept of waste, a tenant's failure to maintain, diminishing the value of the lord's property, was actionable in law, and the medieval categories of voluntary and permissive waste survive in English property law to this day. Your landlord could take you to court for not fixing your roof in 1340, and can do so now, along largely the same reasoning. Then the practice that most upends modern assumptions: houses moved. Because a timber frame is a jointed, pegged, numbered kit, it can be taken apart in reverse order and put back together somewhere else, and medieval and post-medieval people did this routinely. The pegs are driven out, the joints separated, the timbers carted, and the whole thing re-erected on a new plinth. It was cheaper than felling and framing anew, especially once suitable timber grew scarce. The evidence for it is right there in the buildings. Frames turn up with redundant mortises, empty joints cut for members that aren't there, indicating the timber previously stood in a different arrangement. Assembly marks run in sequences that don't match the building's current layout. Dendrochronological dates come back older than the site's documented occupation. Timbers show weathering on faces that are now internal, meaning they were once outside. Building historians have documented cases where a frame was clearly erected, dismantled, and re-erected more than once, and buildings that contain reused timber from 2 or 3 earlier structures of different dates. A medieval house is often a second-hand object made of second-hand parts, the reuse extended down to fragments, ship's timbers in buildings, building timbers in ships, roof beams cut down into joists, doors becoming floorboards, and the endless salvage of iron nails, hinges, locks, and lead. When a monastic house was dissolved in the 1530s, the lead came off the roof first because lead was money, and then the stone was quarried away by locals for generations, which is why so many English abbeys survive as skeletal walls in a field, while the village 3 miles away has abbey-cut ashlar in its garden boundaries and abbey window tracery holding up a barn. Which brings us to why so few medieval houses survive at all, and the answer is simply that the vast majority were never meant to. Earthfast buildings rotted on a generational cycle. Daub returned to soil, thatch composted. What survives is the top few percent, the buildings that were well built enough, well sited enough, and continuously valuable enough that someone kept repairing them for 600 years. And even then, survival was often accidental. Buildings survived because they became barns, because they were encased in later brick and forgotten, because a town became poor and nobody could afford to redevelop it. Lavenham in Suffolk is a town of extraordinary late medieval timber-framed houses, precisely because the wool trade that built it collapsed and left the town with no money to modernise for 300 years. Poverty is the great preservative, and the dating of what remains has been transformed within living memory. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, works because trees in a temperate climate lay down 1 growth ring per year, thick in good years and thin in bad, producing a pattern shared by all trees in a region. Master chronologies built from overlapping sequences now run continuously back thousands of years, and matching a sample from a building beam against them can date the felling of that tree to a single year, and where the bark edge survives to a season, whether the tree came down in winter or in the growing season. The precision this delivers is remarkable. Buildings previously assigned to a vague 15th century on stylistic grounds now carry dates like 1417 or 1483. Sometimes the results overturn a century of assumption. Sometimes they confirm the stylistic dating exactly, and thereby validate the whole framework. The Harmondsworth Great Barn, long guessed to be 13th century, was dated by its rings to the mid-1420s, and when a roof turns out to contain timbers felled in 3 different decades, you learn that the building was extended, repaired, or assembled from salvage, history you could not have read any other way. Which is the note I want to end on. Everything in this whole story, the post holes, the carpenter's marks, the smoke-blackened rafters, the redundant mortices, the burnt daub with hazel impressions pressed into it, is a record left accidentally by people who were not trying to leave a record. They were trying to be dry and warm and to have somewhere for the cattle. They chose a curved tree because it fitted the truss. They cut 4 into a beam so the raising would go smoothly on a cold morning. They put a burn mark by the door because the door was where things got in. None of it was for us, and all of it survived anyway, which is the quiet generosity of ordinary work. So the next time you're in an old building and the floor is a step down from the street, and the beams have long splits running with the grain, and the whole frontage leans out over the pavement, you'll know that the floor rose, the oak dried, and the jetty was for the rent. Somebody built that, green and wet and by hand, out of trees. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well, wherever you are, and if the roof over you is doing its job tonight, spare a thought for the people who worked out how.